So Andrew Yang went on Rising, and he was asked about the drug war by Crystal Ball here. And his answer is pretty solid.
I would decriminalize opiates that are being used for personal use and aren't being distributed. So in addition to decriminalizing marijuana, I would decriminalize opiates for personal use.
That's a big deal. I mean, does that include heroin?
Yes, it does. I mean, at this point, what's happened is you had this OxyContin addiction that has morphed into fentanyl and heroin,
right,
which are frankly more accessible and sometimes less expensive than the OxyContin that started the addiction chain.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Portugal model, what they've done? Because it's very similar to what you're saying. They essentially decriminalized all drug use, including heroin. They have injection sites where people can go and be dosed, but also have access to treatment rather than being thrown in prison. We're not talking about dealers here. We're talking about individual addicts. I mean, is that essentially, is that consistent with what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I was inspired by Portugal's success, where in the wake of this change in approach, they saw a massive reduction in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates. So I'm for safe injection sites, safe consumption sites, and I'm for referring addicts to treatment instead of jail and letting them know this.
That was awesome. And that was bold, because he was asked very clearly, what about heroin? And he was like, yeah. So in other words, he believes as a matter of principle that, I'm not joking, this isn't a criminal issue. And I'm not muddying the waters in any way. This is not a criminal issue. And in his mind, it's more of a medical issue. It's more of a rehab issue. So I'm not going to arbitrarily draw the line at certain substances and not others. I think drug addicts need treatment. And I think that we should copy the model that has worked, and that, of course, is Portugal. And they've gone the furthest left on this issue compared to everybody. But massive credit to Andrew Yang there. Now, I actually, and you guys know this, I would maybe even go a little bit further. I think that the beginning of the conversation is where he is now, which is legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana, decriminalize all substances. I would go a step further and legalize. Now, decriminalize is just, you're not going to go to prison. That's what decriminalize is, very simply. Legalize means it's actually legal to sell these products. So what he's saying is, no, it could still be illegal to sell the products, but certainly for the user, certainly for the addicts, they're not criminals. They get help if they want help, including for all these different substances. I've always been a fan of legalization, taxation, and regulation, because I think that that's the only way you can really fully obliterate the black market for these substances. And then by extension, that's the only way you massively reduce the crime rate. Now, I also think that if you go down that road, you have to have, as part of Medicare for All, mental health facilities and rehab facilities. So along with standard healthcare, those things I think should be included in standard healthcare packages, and people should just be able to go to rehab. So treatment, I agree with him, is the answer, but I would just go a little bit further and do legalization, taxation, or regulation, and that also allows you, because a lot hinges on that last word, regulation, that then allows you to have laws when it comes to dosing. And you actually educate people so much more than now when stuff is on the black market. Look at what happened with Philip Seymour Hoffman. He was a heroin addict, and he went to go buy heroin, and the normal dose that he would give himself, it was cut with fucking fentanyl. And so he died. That stuff is like an elephant tranquilizer. So he took what he thought was his normal dose, and he died. Not because he OD'd on heroin, but because the heroin was laced with fentanyl, because it's made on the black market and it's underground and it's cut with all types of terrible stuff, and then that's why he died. So in my opinion, legalization, taxation, and regulation is the way to go. However, he's the closest to my position on this issue of everybody in the race, because Bernie has made clear that he's only talking about marijuana when it comes to legalization, and then, when he went on Rising and Crystal pushed him a little bit further on other substances, he said, I'm not there yet. Whereas Andrew Yang is saying very openly, decriminalize all drugs. So nobody should be locked up when it comes to some sort of addiction issue, when it comes to using these substances. And he deserves a lot of credit because, again, can you imagine? I just want you to reflect on this for 1 second. Could you think of Kamala Harris making that argument? not in a million years. I can think of, Bernie in a year and a half or 2 years saying something like this, but he hasn't yet. But definitely none of the boring centrist candidates, establishment candidates, would ever make this argument. And that's why it brings me nothing but joy to see Andrew Yang in some polls is beating Kamala Harris, who's like the darling of the media, who they've been trying to push on us since the very beginning, who they want her to win. But Andrew Yang is outpolling. He's outpolling at least like, when you looked at the entire Democratic race to this point, he's outpolling like at least 10 establishment characters. And I think that's absolutely wonderful, because you like to have a race where you have all these different options and all these different ideologies that are present, where the people actually believe what they're talking about and they actually care and they're making their argument for their philosophy as to why you should elect them. I love that. So you have candidates who mean something. Like Bernie means something. He has all these reasons he's running. Tulsi means something. Her biggest issue, she tells you, is foreign policy, and I want to put this front and center. In the case of Andrew Yang, his biggest thing is UBI. But also, isn't it interesting when you have candidates who genuinely believe in something that they often surprise you, and they surprise you in a positive direction? And that's really what this is. So hopefully this helps move the Overton window a little bit. Unfortunately, I don't know if it will, because there's still massive bias against every outsider in the media. So I don't know how much, this of play this will get. And if they do cover it, it'll be negative. They'll act like it was a terrible thing he said. But no, he's absolutely correct. So you should, at the very least, decriminalize all these drugs, because it is not a criminal issue. By the way, there was a time in U.S. history where none of these substances were criminal. It was in don't quote me on it because I don't remember, but it was in 19-something. I don't know whether it was like 1910 or 1920 or 1930. Somewhere in there is when we had our first drug laws, where it was criminalization. And, mind you, it was strongly tied to racism, because they saw, Mexicans use this marijuana stuff, so let's criminalize that so we can criminalize a Mexican lived experience, a Hispanic lived experience. When it came to opium, it was Chinese immigrants. They would have the opium dens. And apparently, you had white people were scared that their kids would go into the opium den, and so they criminalized it. So the way that all this stuff developed, it's not like you had people all stand around and it was like scientists who were being objective and they're like, well, this substance by itself is very, very damning and very bad for you, but this one is okay. I feel like that's what a lot of people naively think in the back of their mind subconsciously, like, obviously it's somewhere along the line there was a logical reason for this. No. It was all cultural, bigotry fed into it. Why do you, whiskey is definitely worse for you than marijuana. But why is whiskey legal and marijuana is not legal? Because when you go back to the origins of it, it was white people who loved their alcohol. Not saying others didn't, but it was definitely primarily them, predominantly them. And it was brown people who were smoking the marijuana. So this is where it all stems from. So why not change this incredibly primitive, archaic, and dumb system? And Andrew Yang absolutely hit the nail on the head here. Massive credit to him for coming out in favor of decriminalizing all drugs and copying Portugal's model.